We're going to get started with chapter 14 today. Chapter 14 deals with Mendel. He's like the father of genetics and his idea of genes. And genes are how we inherit things. Okay. When we look at the deck of genes, if you want to think it that way, your characteristics that you inherit from your parents. There was for a long time, there was this blending idea. If if your dad had brown eyes and you had blue eyes, you were going to get like somewhere in between. And they found that wasn't necessarily true. For some things it is, but some things it isn't. And they wanted to know, why? Why do you get some characteristics and some don't show up? Okay. So this hypothesis, they called it a particulate. They said it comes from your parents pass on genes. Okay. And a gene, now we know, is a small piece of DNA. But we didn't know that at the time because they didn't know about DNA and they didn't know about chromosomes and all this other stuff. So they're trying to figure out what are these units that determine what we inherit. Okay. Mendel, he was this monk and he did a ton of experiments with garden pea plants. And through his results, he came up with all kinds of ideas, which is really cool because the ideas he came up with, even though he didn't know about DNA and chromosomes and all that, he didn't know anything about that, but his ideas through his experiments were spot on, and they still are. So he came up with all these ideas of genetics, even though he didn't have the microscopic information, but yet he still was, did a great job, if you want to call it that. There's his pea plants. And this is Mendel right here. Okay, so he was a monk. He had lots and lots of time on his hand. So he did a lot of work with pea plants and came up with the basis of genetics. And again, he's considered the father of genetics. Okay, so he used a scientific approach and he looked at inheritance. Why do you inherit certain characteristics? Okay, he wanted to know the basic. Well, he basically, he discovered the basics of genetics, the basis of hereditary. And he did it using garden pea plants. Okay. And he did a bunch of carefully planned experiments, collected his results, looked at his results, and came up with all kinds of ideas. And like I said, he was spot on. Okay. His approach allowed him to deduce a lot of different principles. Okay. The ideas he came up with, again, from not having any idea of the microscopic DNA kind of stuff, is pretty impressive if you think about it. Okay, he knew that there was things that we inherited. Okay, there was features, and he called them characters, like flower color if you're talking about peas. For people, it might be hair color or eye color or whatever. Okay, so that we have characteristics, or we have characters, he called them, that we inherit from our parents. And he said, now each characteristic or each character has a variant. In other words, like if you're talking about flowers, they might have purple flowers or they might have white flowers. Okay. So he called each variant a trait. So you have characters, again, some characteristic about you, and then there's more than one trait that leads to that characteristic. Okay. And he used pea plants. There was a lot of different varieties. He could do a lot of different experiments, and he used them. Well, we'll talk about why he used pea plants here in a minute. Okay. The advantage, next slide. The advantage of using pea plants, first of all, there's a very short generation time. He could do a lot of experiments in a short time. Okay. If you do experiments with animals, if you like looking at breeding horses, you're talking 11 months for one, generation. So it takes a long time. And then it would be a while before that, if you were looking at the next generation after that, you've got to wait till that full matures and blah, blah. So, it's not easy to do. But when you're talking about plants, they've got short generation times. He could do like 4 generations in a year, probably. Okay. They have huge amounts of offspring. Again, with animals, if you have a huge amount of offspring, then what do you do with them when you're done? Okay. Unless you're doing like one of the most common things to use genetics with is fruit flies. You don't really worry about when you're done, just kind of getting rid of them. But you got to look at whatever you're trying to do your genetics on. Okay. He could control the mating. In other words, he could self-pollinate plants. He could cross-pollinate. He can control that very easily in the pea plants. And I'll show you how. What he did was the parental generation, what he started with, the reproductive parts here, he would actually take a brush and take the parts from the stamen and put them on the carpel. So he would be the one that introduce the male and the female parts together, and then he would cover it so that nothing else could get in there. Okay. And then he'd look at the results, and then he'd get his first generation. So the parental generation is the P generation, and then the first offspring they call the F1, because that's the first philia generation, because you can do the second generation, the grandkids, that would be F2, and so on and so forth. But he could control it easily by basically opening up the P plants, and he would transfer them, and then he'd cover them so that nothing else could get in. Okay. He chose to track only characters that occurred in 2 distinct forms. So like if he found something that had like 3 different characteristics, like, maybe there was the size of the pea plant, there was short, medium, and tall, he wouldn't use something like that. Instead, he would use, if it was just short and tall, or 2 different, if there was white and there was purple for the colors, or the seeds were wrinkled or smooth. He just looked at ones that only had two traits. Okay. He also used varieties that he called were true breeding. Okay. Plants that produce offspring of the same variety. So he would self-pollinate them. He'd take ones with purple flowers and pollinate them with purple flowers. And he had to make sure that all they had were purple flowers. If they had something else in there, then they knew that they weren't true breeding. Okay. He knew that there was another characteristic in there. Okay. So in a typical experiment, he made 2 contrasting true breeding varieties, and he called that hybridization. In other words, he took a purple and a white. Those 2 are different. They're a hybrid. Okay. If they're the same, then they're not a hybrid. Okay. And you see here the word hybridization a lot in plants. They use it a lot in agriculture to get, wheat, forms of wheat that are more resistant to various things. And there's all kinds of hybridization. But a hybridization means that you have contrasting characteristics. Okay, so the true breeding parents of the first generation you start with is called the P generation, the parental generation. And he wanted to make sure, again, they were true. In other words, they had only the characteristic he was looking for. That's all they had. They didn't have like a hidden recessive trait anywhere. Okay, and then when he bred the P1 generation, in other words, he took a purple flower and bred it with a white, and then he looked at the babies, the children. They were the F1 generation. It's first philia, or just the F1 generation. Okay. Then what he would do is he'd take the F1 generation and he'd self-pollinate some of them, or cross-pollinate the other ones. So he'd take these F hybrids and cross them with each other. And then he'd get the grandchildren, and they were called the F2 generation. Those were the grandchildren from the P generation. And again, looking at the colors, looking at whatever characteristic he was doing. And he did lots of these. And we're not talking like 10. We're talking tens of thousands to get all the numbers. Okay. So one of the things he found out that Mendel did right away was his true breeding. Like if he was doing white flowers and purple flowers, all of the generation, the children from the parental generation were purple. There were no white ones at all. He knew that that trait had to be in there because he bred purple and white. Okay. So, and then when he took all the purples from the first generation, the children, and crossed them, then he got some white ones back. So most of them were purple, about 75%, but about 25% were white. He was like, so that characteristic was there, it was just covered up. Okay. So, and he discovered the ratio was 3-to-1, purple to white in the grandchildren in the F2 generation. Okay. So again, he started with the parental generation. He had purple and white, and these were self-pollinated first to make sure that there was no, if you bred them and you ended up with some white flowers, you knew that they weren't pure, if you want to call it that. So he called them true breeding. So he'd do that first. Then he bred these, and he ended up with all purple flowers. But when he took these guys and bred them, he ended up with, you can see 705 purple, 224. So he had 1,000 in his grandchildren generation. The white came back again. Okay, so it was a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, so he reasoned that the purple flower factor was affecting the other one. Okay, the purple must be like a stronger trait. And what he called it then was, since the purple covered up the white one, he called it the dominant trait. Okay, the dominant trait will cover up the recessive trait. The white flower was the recessive trait. And we have these too. Okay, eye color, dominant is brown, recessive is blue. Okay, if you get a trait for a brown and a blue, you'll have brown. The only way you can have blue is to recessive. And we'll talk more about that. And so you'd think there'd be way more people with brown eyes and blue eyes, and it's not true. But we'll show you why that happens, okay? Okay, the factor of the white flowers, it wasn't diluted, it wasn't destroyed, it was just covered up. And then it reappeared when you got to the F2 generation, okay? So when you have these traits, sometimes you have a dominant one and a recessive one. And if you get the dominant one, you have that trait. Okay, in order to be recessive, you have to have 2 of the recessive trait. Okay, so he observed the same pattern inherent. He did 6 other P characteristics and he got this exact same results. Okay, so if they had 2 traits, again, he said there's this heritable factor. There's something, and now we call it a gene. Okay, he just called it a character or something that you inherit, a heritable factor, but now we call them genes. Okay, here's some of the other ones he did. He did purple and white, which we already talked about. He did yellow seeds versus green seeds. Green was the recessive, and look at the numbers 3 to 1. He did the shape 3 to 1. He did inflated, like they poof out, or they're like, this always looks like vacuum packed to me, 3 to 1. He did green versus yellow for the pod colors, 3 to 1. He did where the flowers were, numbers 3 to 1. And he did tall versus small. And again, almost 3 to 1. So when he did all these different characteristics, he got the same results. Okay. So again, here's some, oh, I got them all there. I already showed them to you. Anyway, so he hypothesized that if we had a 3 to 1 inheritance pattern in the F2 generation, he came up with some ideas to make up his model. Okay. These concepts could be related to how we know. I mean, it's easy to figure these out now because we know about genes and we know about chromosomes. It was pretty cool that Mendel figured it out when he didn't have a clue about any of that stuff. Okay, but he was right. I mean, he knew that there was something there that was being passed on. He just didn't know what it was exactly or how it was, but he knew it was there and he figured out the numbers. Okay, first, alternative versions, sorry you guys, of gene accounts for variations. Okay, so we have different varieties. For example, okay, you got the flower color in a pea plant. It has 2 versions, purple and white. A lot of the characteristics, especially in higher level like humans, we have more than 2. So we can't really condense it down to that. But there are some, especially like, when you're breeding rabbits or something else, you have maybe only 2 versions, okay? So what he called the 2 characteristics, okay, if they only had 2, he called them alleles. Actually, now we do more than that. Because like for your blood type, there's 3 alleles. There's A, B, and O, okay? So sometimes you have more than that, but he called them alleles. The alternate gene version were called alleles, okay? And each gene resides on a specific chromosome, okay? So like eye color might be on chromosome 6. And so you'd get a chromosome 6 from mom and a chromosome 6 from dad. And on the same spot on those 2 chromosomes, you'll have your 2 alleles. Okay, one might be for brown eyes, one might be for blue eyes, depending on, but they're going to be in the same spot and they're going to determine your eye color. Okay, and it really comes down to that when you're talking about the dominant versus the recessive, there's going to be a spot. If this is the allele for purple flowers, there's an enzyme that's activated by that, and in this case, there's no enzyme. And that's the lack of color, if you want to call it, with the white. So when it comes right down to it, when we're talking about dominant recessive, the dominant one's going to have an enzyme that synthesizes something, okay? And in this case, it's the color. The recessive one won't have that. So if you don't have it, if both of them don't have it, and you don't get that enzyme, then you're going to get the white flowers, okay? And that's kind of how it works. But again, Mendel knew nothing about any of this stuff. And it's your code in your DNA. Okay, that determines that, but that's how they've determined it now. Again, Mendel didn't do that. He didn't know anything about chromosomes and DNA and nitrogen bases and any of that stuff, but that's how it basically works. Okay, where are we at here? Okay, I think we're going to end here because we're almost at 15 minutes. Okay, so we'll pick up the next part when we get to here.